Hager from the University of Minnesota. She holds a position as research engineer and instructor. She's been involved in biosystems and everything else since 1998 and is quite familiar with our industry. I'd like to introduce her and bring her on board. She's going to be talking about online record keeping, why and how. Please give her your attention. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Just checking the mic. You can all hear me well. I want to first thank the organization for inviting me here. This is, I think, the third time I've been to this conference, and this is the biggest group I ever talked to. And as a girl who grew up on a small farm, my dad would be proud if he were still alive that I'm up in front of this room. So what I'm going to talk to you about this morning is online record keeping. And this was a result of a three-year national grant we had to develop a free tool for all of you to use. To basically, the real goal is to educate consumers. I think as an industry in the last 20, 30 years, we've come a long way in understanding how systems work in design and site evaluation and installation and inspection. And then we build these systems and we hand them over to homeowners who are oftentimes clueless. And we try to give them information, but I'm going to talk about some of the challenges and why we developed this tool. So most of you have interacted with the University of Minnesota because we have been doing education since the mid-70s. I was really lucky to be hired into that program almost 20 years ago now. And really, when you look at what we do, we mainly educate people like you all. But you are the people who actually educate the homeowners. So we've developed educational materials, but we understand that the industry, it takes all of us to get homeowners to better understand their septic systems. I did want to tell you, I learned some things about Houston this morning. I wanted to give you a little bit of information about Minnesota. Who's ever been to Minnesota? Right? What are we always known as, right? Land of 10,000 lakes. How many lakes are in Minnesota? Is it 10,000? Right, of course not. But 11,842 doesn't quite have the same ring as 10,000. So we have lots of high water tables. We also have a lot of rivers and streams, so there's water pretty much everywhere. What Minnesota is usually known for, though, with our lakes is how darn cold it is, right? I see people here wearing jackets. It's tropical right now, right, when I got here. So we are not the coldest state in the U.S. because there is Alaska, but in the lower 48, the lowest recorded temperature in Barris, Minnesota, negative 60 degrees, and that's not with the wind, right? It's cold, but it's a dry cold. It's still darn cold, right? Things that come out of Minnesota that you probably see every day are things like Cheerios. There's a lot of mining and manufacturing in Minnesota. 3M is out of Minnesota. Some things you otherwise might know. My favorite Minnesotan, unfortunately, is no longer with us. That would be Prince, who passed away, but right, Bob Dylan, Jessica Lange, Judy Garland, things along those lines. We don't all talk like the movie Fargo, and so if any of you have seen the movie Fargo, Fargo is in North Dakota. But if you do get into northern Minnesota, just like you all have an accent, and I know up here I'm talking, I have an accent, right? There is a very northern Minnesota accent. So back to the topic at hand. Why would you think about using this tool? What were the objectives of the tool we developed? I'm going to show you some attributes of the tool, and finally, how you would use the tool. I've done presentations where I actually go online and use it. It doesn't work quite so well in a big format like this because, one, I don't have a computer up here. But it is really, once you get online, and again, it is an online platform, and we'll talk about why we moved to online. So this was a collaborative effort. So you can see the funding for this came from the National Institute of Food and Agriculture. And honestly, it was really exciting that they would actually fund a project about septic systems. So the University of Minnesota was the lead institution, but we had people from across the U.S. involved. Because our goal is that this wouldn't just work in Minnesota, it would work in Texas, in Florida, in California. So we wanted to make sure when it comes to the terminology of systems, the type of systems, even some of the regulatory requirements, it has that flexibility built in. So we had a lot of technical experts from the on-site world, but we also needed an expert in the online world to make online software and databases to store that. Took expertise that I don't have and I don't want to have. So we hired a company, the Carney Group, that actually developed the interface that you will see if you go to the website. So again, why did we do this? Ultimately, we all know systems need to be managed. So 25% of our population is on on-site systems across the US, and the beautiful thing for our industry is that amount is increasing, that we are actually seeing more on-site systems built, and that does vary from state to state if that number is increasing, but when you look at the general trend, we are going to be having more systems, and generally a lot of the systems we're building have a higher level of care. We developed all the easy land, right? We're left with often sites that have poor soil conditions, that often need secondary treatment, where we can't just rely upon passive treatment. Whenever we can, the soil is an amazing treatment mechanism, but we don't always have it. So, and I think this next point is one of the most important things, and it ties into the talk we just had when we talk about reuse, is that septic systems must be managed. When I think about the difference between the centralized world and the decentralized often, is how often those centralized systems and the level of management, they have to have an operator, right? That operator, depending on the scale, is evaluating that system every single day. Well, that has a high cost with it, don't get me wrong, but we know that our systems need to be managed too. And one of the reasons why it's so important is if we, again, want to be viewed to be equal infrastructure, and I would argue better infrastructure, we need to have, I would say, strong management programs. I think about the auto industry, right? Everybody knows they need to get their oil changed, right? We all know that. How many times have you heard someone say, I've never pumped my septic tank? Right? We all have, and they're proud when they say it. And I say to that homeowner, if you told me you never changed your oil on my car, I wouldn't buy your car. That's how I now feel about your septic system. But that just goes to show that everybody knows to get their oil changed. But yet, many homeowners don't understand how important that regular maintenance is. So when we look at, there are problems out there. So good operating septic systems protect public health and the environment, but we know across the US we have systems that aren't performing. According to the EPA, at least 10% of systems are in some form of failure. And it really does vary from state to state how we define failure. But you also look that when state agencies are looking at contamination of groundwater, septic systems are the third most common identified problem. So the issue too is if we are not managing systems, one, that failure rate is going to be accelerated. And second, we can have systems that are failing that we don't even know they're failing, right? So now we have effluent on the surface, right? The dog's playing in it, coming into the house, giving you kisses, right? And no one understands that that's a problem. So ultimately, we, with our septic systems, are a part of this overall hydrologic cycle. And to me, one of the best things about on-site systems is that we are returning that water back into the aquifer. So, right, looking at whether it be farms or homes that are spread on the landscape, many of those, again, are using well water as their drinking water source. So when we have a septic system, the nice thing is that water is either going to be feeding a deeper aquifer, or that water is going to be feeding a lake, river, or stream. But it is, again, the difference is, you know, right, I live in the city of Minneapolis, right? I'm on the Mississippi River. So my wastewater, unfortunately, right, goes to the city of Minneapolis, who then takes that water and sends it into the river, which ends up in the Gulf of Mexico. And there's one reason why I do live in Minnesota. You know, I don't like the cold, I'm going to be honest with you. But the good thing is that they say by the time that wastewater gets to the Gulf of Mexico, it's been through 56 digestive systems, right? And there's still a few towns upgrading into Minneapolis, but not very many. But again, overall, what we're looking at is that if our septic systems are being well managed, we are a sustainable part of keeping water within the watershed instead of sending it downstream. Because thinking about where I live in Minneapolis, I actually drink river water. But most of the suburbs around most of our big cities are using groundwater. So now they're taking up groundwater That groundwater, again, now is going to a wastewater treatment plant that's sending it typically out of the watershed. So here again, where you have more reservoirs, you're actually doing, with our lakes, we don't build reservoirs, right? So all of our wastewater plants were built on rivers to take that water away from us. So managing systems is important for other reasons. First, you'll see on this list is that we have increased regulatory expectations. So more and more counties and states are requiring operating permits, verification that management is happening. We also see more cluster systems and more systems with advanced treatment, where management becomes more critical. When you have a conventional system with a tank and a drain field, it's pretty straightforward, right? Get your tank pumped. But when you start looking at aerobic units, media filters, drip systems, spray systems, disinfection, now all of a sudden the management requirements went way up. I have to talk a little bit about this picture real quick. So this is, you all know, right? So those are filters on a drip system. And Ron yesterday mentioned lint. So lint is my current topic that I'd really love to find some research funding on. He sent me this picture because the filter on the right is just covered with lint. So it was from a commercial facility that was using these wipes that, of course, weren't breaking down, right? But that were being caught. So as we see changes in product usage, commercial usage, it's another time where management is even more important and critical to that system performing. So how much waste are we talking about? If you look at 25% of the population, we're talking about 5 billion gallons of water every day. Then we look at all the commercial properties. EPA estimates there's over 350,000 existing large capacity septic systems. And when you look at large capacity, the risk, it's about risk, is that when we have larger septic systems, if we don't properly manage them, the impact to the environment and public health can be higher. So we do need more information. So I already mentioned this. I think that our wastewater septic industry, the professionals like you all in this room, have become, in general, very highly educated, along with our regulators. But the challenge is that how do we get all of the information? And again, they don't need it all. But how do we get more of the information needed down to the customer level? So we really, again, need sound management guidance to this perspective of the system owner. You can look up most systems and find out very specific nuts and bolts, how do you take care of that system? But it's usually at a way too technical level for the average homeowner. So there's, again, lots of general information. And so I pulled up two examples here. One's a homeowner's guide we have in Minnesota. Another is one that's developed here in Texas. And I'm not saying those are misinformation, but they're generic, right? They're like, you have a septic system. And then the internet is full of garbage, right? You can find just about anything. Someone selling the magic product that if they flush will make their system work. So as a consumer, I think it's also very difficult if you're just going online and you have a problem, because that's why you're going online, is to figure out what should I do about my septic system. A lot of the information that's out there now is also geared towards service providers. So to me, it's either really generic, not necessarily what's in their backyard, or it's on the other hand where it's super technical and they get lost in it. The last thing is customized information. So some of that stuff, again, good information, but it's not, again, what's at your house. So the tool we developed, one of the goals is you would tell them exactly what's in their property. You may even put a nice little picture of their house on the front, and they'll be like, oh, that's my system, where they can see where components are in their actual backyard. So along with this, one of the goals is raising the bar for management expectations. So if a homeowner understands some of the critical aspects that are going to happen during a service visit with a contract that you have with them, when the other guy comes along and says, you know, I can do that for half the price, he's overcharging you. Well, do they actually know what they're paying for? Do they know they're getting good service? So this tool actually lays out some things they need to do, which are relatively minimal, but we know they send the wastewater to us, so they're part of the equation. But then the next piece is what aspects should be taken care of when you're doing a service visit for them. So they know that everything's being covered. So you can see the bottom line goal is to educate system owners to define long-term maintenance activities. So there's two goals really with that then, is that systems are going to last longer, and there's actually more and more data showing that if we well manage systems, there is corresponding longevity. But to most homeowners, this will hit them in the pocketbook, right? If their system lasts longer, that in fact will save them money. So why did we go online? Well, we know that's where the world is. Right now, there's like half of this room that's on their phone, right? So it just makes sense that we would develop one. And honestly, no one had done it yet, which is actually surprising. And so ours was a grant, so that means it's free. I guarantee, well, yeah, I'll guarantee, because what are you going to hold me to, right? In the next 5 years, someone will be doing something like this, and they'll be selling it to you. Because ultimately, having something along these lines makes sense, because everything's going electronic. So many of you have databases, right, where you're tracking your customers, you're doing things along those lines. This isn't that. This isn't, again, software that's going to track your customers. That software already exists. This is actually software that is going to take the components of the system and develop a customized homeowner guide for them. So it does two additional things. One, it allows for a national perspective on management. When you tell them, this is what you need to do to take care of your system, there's the occasional homeowner that's like, oh, they're just trying to make money on me, right? That I don't need to do all that. Well, this has, again, built-in national guidance related to the service provider program that was developed years ago by Bruce Lessiker. So what kind of maintenance should happen with a septic tank, with an ATU, with a drip field? But it does allow for local variation, because at the end of the day, you may be under a very specific operating permit requirement by your county or by your state, so it does allow for that. Another beautiful thing about it being online is if that owner changes, it'll take you 2 minutes to update that guide. Change the name on it, PDF a new one, send it to the new owner. If you add a component, if there's a change in how you're going to manage it, it's super easy once it's developed because it's all stored in a database. The last thing about it being online is that all of this information is going into a database. We currently don't even have a way to mine it, meaning to go in and look at all that data, but if somewhere down the road we wanted to find what's the average size septic tank being installed, we could pull that data. I will tell you along with that it is, again, we will never, ever, ever sell any of this information, because ultimately that would be a huge violation, because there are potentially names, addresses, system types. There's a lot of good information that someone might want, but again, being a university, we would never do that. So the next question is, why one that works for communities? So this doesn't just work for individual systems, it works for any size septic system that we will deal with. So ultimately, we are seeing across the US more cluster and community systems. So there's lots of reasons why we see more of these. So it could be because there's no room. I don't know about you all, but we did some bad planning, and we have lots that really aren't sustainable to have septic systems on individual properties. So then a bunch of homeowners get together, right, and install a system. There's also issues about total daily maximum load. So I don't know where your impaired water program is here in Texas, but in Minnesota, we've identified lots of lakes, rivers, streams that either the fish are having trouble living in or they're not safe to swim in. So again, those are called impaired waters. So when those waters get impaired, they look at all the contributing sources and figure out who's adding whatever the contaminant is. So often we have now seen wastewater treatment plants that, for instance, can't meet their phosphorus limit. So now they're looking at, well, we can't add any more wastewater, right? So we're actually seeing developments go in because they can't access the municipal plant. The municipal plant isn't treating to the required standards, so they can't add flow. So again, another very common reason why we see cluster systems being built is because wastewater treatment plants are expensive. Between the collection system, the treatment mechanism, the permits, often going with a cluster system is more cost effective. I have actually never seen a fair evaluation comparing clusters and municipal where a soil-based cluster system wasn't less costly. Smart growth initiatives. So this would relate to, for instance, the LEED certification. So there are developers who are actually looking to develop and treat wastewater on site. And finally, we just simply have areas that the sewer is too far away and the cost of extending it, it's just not going to happen. So we are seeing more developments occur on cluster systems. So with that, we're going to move into the actual objectives. When we look to develop this tool, we had several things in mind from the beginning. So the first is we had to develop both the content and the web interface. And it was kind of easy to focus on the content because that's the part I know, right? But ultimately, we spent a lot of time figuring out how to make a user-friendly interface. So the second objective was to create expert-driven. So that goes to the national perspective on what is critical management, but allow it to be locally customized. So this manual will work for any soil-based wastewater treatment system. It does actually also allow for systems that offlot discharge or spray, but we're still, again, except with that offlotting, we're still using the site. It wasn't designed to deal with large wastewater treatment plants. Even though sometimes our technology is scaled down versions, it really is focused on the decentralized industry. And again, the goal of the guide, when it's completed and handed over to that homeowner, is to provide owners and users with that fundamental information. And I've had people argue with me, you know, homeowners aren't going to read this. And I understand that's true. And it really will depend on the owner, and it may depend on, did they just get a system that was really expensive? Did they have problems with their old one? And ultimately, how excited are they about their septic system? So I'll give you the example, right? So for years, I had wanted a Vitamix. I don't know if any of you know what Vitamixes are, but they are ridiculously expensive blenders, right? I think I ended up getting one finally, and the blender was like, I think it was like $600, right? Who needs a $600 blender? Really no one. But anyway, so I got this blender, and with it came a DVD and a manual. And do you think I watched it, or did I start blending? No, I watched it because I was so darn excited about my new Vitamix. And I said to my husband, you need to watch this because you're not messing up my new blender, right? So I made him watch it with me too. Works great, love it, right? Had a friend stay at our house, hadn't watched the video. There's this plunger you put in the middle. He somehow got it in the blender. It's fine. The blender can take it. I mean, this thing takes avocado pits and grinds them up. It's amazing. So ultimately, the reason why I tell this story is every homeowner you deal with is excited about their septic system as I was about my Vitamix. No, I understand that. But at the end of the day, the reason why we give them this is most of my manuals, do you know where they go? They go into a pile, right? And I know with a lot of this stuff, it's going electronic. That's why we also give them an electronic copy. I put them in that pile and I look at it. When one, I either have a problem, or two, I'm like, oh, when do I need to get my transmission fluid changed? Like something in the back of my mind tells me I should be looking at that. So it will be a reference document, but the other thing I also believe it does is it protects you. You are giving them the information. It'd be like going to the car dealership with 30,000 miles and saying it's not working and never ever changed the oil. They're like, we told you. We gave you the information about what needs to happen. So I think it's also just a kind of covering yourself to say, we gave you really good information about your system. So the scale for this, again, does go from a single family home up to a large cluster system. When we were first developing this, we were really geared more on community systems because there was really not a lot of information out there. But thinking about how many individual systems there are across the US, there's a lot more of those than clusters. So we were in fact kind of missing our largest audience. So we made sure it works well. So it does at the end of the day create an electronic document. So that electronic document can be printed. If you again have something that you want to be able to hand to an owner, you can do that. But it's a PDF, so it can be emailed, right? If it were a community system, it could be posted to the community website. And it can also, therefore, be easily updated. So if anything changes about the system, the user, any details, you can go in. So kind of throughout this presentation, I'm just showing examples of finished guides. So this is one we did for Actually, our Department of Transportation has a bunch of rest areas, so they wanted owner's guides created. So a couple things I'll point out. There's a little logo at the top here. If you were using this tool, if I were using it and I were you, that logo would be your company logo, right? You made this for them. The thing you'll see right below that, right, is the name. So that could be the property owner's name. In this case, it's the rest area. And we chose, again, to put a picture of the rest area. If you had a nice picture of their septic system, you could put it on the front, right? But often we don't see septic systems, right? That's the good of them, and sometimes the bad of them is they're not something that's visual on the landscape. So that's, again, kind of the idea of the front, is that immediately they know that this is for their property. So where the actual tool is found this is the web address. So this is our little logo, but if you ever try to put that ampersand sign in, that doesn't work in the internet, so we had to spell it out. So again, water and maintenance, that's what we're really looking at. So h2nom.com is the tool. And initially, when we developed this tool, I thought it would be more geared towards a new system. So you're the designer, you're the installer, in some instances, maybe you're the county, and you want to give the system owner information. But the only downside of that is there's a lot of opportunities to put photos. So a photo of the tank, of the ATU, where the disinfection unit is, whatever the treatment train is. Those photos don't really, when you do an install, are not how it looks 3 years from now, right? It's a little messy right when you leave. Or if you're the designer, that's when you would kind of be out there too. So it's actually, to me, more ideal if it's something the service provider does, because if the service provider's out there a year later, final grade and landscape is done, that's what the owner sees in their backyard. So the bottom line is it works in either instance. And if a designer's doing it, they may have more of the concept drawing, right, that they'll upload as far as the diagrams. But it would be great if down the road you actually had more photos of the actual site. It'll just make it more realistic. You don't have to upload any photos. But to me, if you do have some photos of the site, it'll make it more real to the system who's using it. So the actual tool is a survey. The best example I can give that I've used in my life is TurboTax, right? So it's the idea that you put in you answer some questions. Those questions are then fed into the actual tool language. And I'll show you some examples coming up. So I mentioned it allows for input of local information. So for instance, the number of connections. Well, if it's a single family home, that's pretty simple, right? It's one. But the actual treatment train components. So you pick what kind of collection system, what kind of tanks, does it have any pre-treatment, where does it go after that? You select all those and then you answer a few questions about each of them. So you can see as well any regional, state, or local differences in regulations that affect management can be fed into the tool. So who would use the tool? Everyone in here is going to use the tool, right? That's my goal, everyone. But it doesn't just work for people in this room, but the people in this room, again, engineers and designers, installers, operators, service providers, regulators. We've had some community facilitators, so people who are working with communities. And ultimately, could a developer use it? Could an informed community member? And my general answer is no. But you sometimes run into that owner who knows more about their septic system than average. They could put in the information about their tool or about their system, and the tool will create a guide. The more generic you put in that information, the less specific it's going to be, but it'll still give you some guidance. So ultimately, the guide that's developed at the end is geared towards a homeowner. It is not geared towards you, the service provider. There's lots of manuals out there about how to do that specific stuff. And I'm not saying it's not a bit of a checklist, so we do have tasks, again, that are geared towards the service provider, but our audience still at the end is the homeowner. So what ends up being in each guide? So for each treatment train, and I'll pick a septic tank. So let's say they have a septic tank as part of their system. We don't want to just tell them they have a septic tank and they need to get it pumped. we want to give them a little bit of information about why, right? So what is the purpose of the septic tank, right? Settle sludge, right? Lighter material float up. So there's a little bit of information that they could read. There'll also be a diagram, right, that will show a septic tank. And that's a great example. So we have a generic septic tank. That's not their septic tank, right? If you want to take the time and energy to upload the tank you use, and often, right, you use the same tank over and over again, so you pull that image into your library, or you create a template, we'll talk about these things, you can actually show the exact septic tank that they have on their property in the guide. So there'll be diagrams. You can also then, if you wanted to go the next step, you could snap a photo of their septic tank and upload a photo that is site specific. So then for that septic tank, it's going to list what does the owner do and what do you need a professional to do. And you can actually customize that. So let's say they have an effluent screen on their septic tank. Do you clean it or do they clean it? Well, I find that depends. Most homeowners, I find, don't want to clean their screen, but occasionally you have ones that do. So our default, for instance, in the guide, if you say there's a screen, is that the service provider will clean the screen. But you can change that if you want to and say that it's the owner's responsibility. So there's also, along with that, there's some general management issues and challenges and a troubleshooting guide. And I think that the troubleshooting guide might be the most commonly used section. Right? So their alarm's going off, right? They can smell their septic system. God forbid it's backing up, right? So those are the times they might go read that, and it'll give them some guidance what to do in those instances. So where does the actual content come from? So each of these guides is going to be a combination of boilerplate content that has been reviewed nationally with your customized content. And so what if you don't know the answers to all the questions? So it asks you, for instance, what the design flow is. And let's say, again, you don't know, right? It's the homeowner. Well, the guide that they develop will be more generic. It'll still develop a guide. So ultimately, it also will tell them you probably should talk to the county, the designer, the installer. That information's probably out there. You just don't have it. So now looking at some tool attributes. So we actually, from a few of you in this room who I know have used this tool, we've actually updated it. The nice thing is if you upload a diagram now, so this is our stock image, for instance, of the diagram of a system. It's really generic. If there's one diagram I was going to tell you to change, it would be this one, because they should have a diagram of their system. So again, you can actually upload your own image and put your own caption on it. And now when you do it, it actually shows you what it'll look like in the guide. So how this will work is you go and create, again, a free account. So this account will store all of your projects, and actually only you can access them. So, and we do have a way that you can see if a property already has a guide that was created for it, which is a beautiful problem, right? That you would want to know if someone else had already created a guide. But ultimately, if at some point in time, let's say your company, you changed companies, right? You moved. We can actually transport your guides to someone else, but think about it, the time and energy that it takes you to put that information in, it's yours. If ultimately a homeowner contacted me and said, there's a guide for my system, I can't get a hold of the owner, I would contact you, and if you still didn't want to give it to them, we'd probably have a conversation about can we give them the guide. But that's, again, a problem we haven't had. So you are then going to use the web interface and enter specific site and system information, and then at the end of it, the tool is going to create the electronic O&M manual, which includes stock images and text, and then the things that you uploaded and changed. So this, if you went to the web address right now, this is what you would see. This is, again, the address across the top. And if you were going to register for the first time, you would click on this box. And with websites like this, you can always do it in a bunch of spots. So there's a way to register up here as well. There's a way to register here. It's built in, so depending upon how you think and look at things, you'll figure out how to do it. So there's a disclaimer kind of here on the front telling you a little bit about the tool. So when you go to register for the first time, we do collect some information, but we will not be emailing you. The only time we will email you, for instance, I've mentioned we've been doing some enhancements, so we're going to actually email everyone who we have a web address for and say, there's a new version. The beautiful thing about a new version is the old version's still there. Your guides that you created are never bad. One thing we recently added is the ability to have commercial systems. So it was really in the past just geared towards residences. Well, again, in working with several projects where they wanted to utilize the tool, we really needed a commercial aspect. So when you see here, there are some required fields anytime you see a star, and then you get an email from us. You've all done this before, right? You set up a new account. It just wants to confirm that you actually want the account. So you click on that link, and now you're in. So in the future, your sign in, you create a password, so your email address plus your password, you click sign in, you're into your projects. So again, this is me, and these were screenshots from when I first started doing it. And the reason why I know that is over here it lists my projects, and there's only 3, right? So down the road, you may have a lot more than 3 projects. You can actually search for a site. That would be a site you've done work on or a site another professional may have done. So you can see from this main page, you can edit your profile, you can create a new project, and this is a really nice feature down here, which is an image library. So what I find in the industry is most people design, install, service a lot of the same systems over and over again, right? That you probably have somewhere from a couple to 10 types that you deal with on a more regular basis. Or I mentioned the tank. You may use the same 1,500 2-compartment tank on lots of sites. So you can spend some time up front uploading images that are very common across sites and store them in your library. Because when I first started doing this, the most time it took me was just gathering all the information into one site. So that's a nice feature. So there are help topics, so if it's the first time you're using the tool, it's a good place to go because we put some of the frequently asked questions here, so it's a good resource. One thing, for instance, is what kind of images can you upload? So we actually recently updated this as well because we didn't have PDF as an option. And a lot of the diagram people are doing, they're saving them as PDF, so that was a challenge. So people were having to take a picture of the PDF to get it into a GIF. So we now actually can add PDFs. We do limit the file size, and the main reason for this is otherwise, again, your guides get giant as far as being able to save them. So we do have instructions about, because a lot of smartphones now are taking pretty large file sizes, so we do have some instructions if you don't know how to kind of scale back your images. So here's just an example of that image library, and if you're still dealing with slow internet speeds, this is a great thing to do in the middle of the night, right? You can upload a bunch of diagrams when you don't have anything else going on. So again, you can delete them, you can add them, things along those lines. So again, as far as how to get to your projects, there's lots of ways to do it, as I mentioned. So from this page, when I click on My Projects, I can start a new project. I can add PDF content, which that means I'm going to add more information. I can download the PDF. It tells me when it was last modified, and when you bring this up, it'll always show the date of the last file you worked on. And the last thing you can do is delete. So the first time you go in here, you may just be messing around and making a project that doesn't even exist, right? So you can go in later and actually delete that. So if you're going to create a new project or a template, and I need to talk about templates. So remember how I mentioned you may have the 5 systems you do all the time. So let's say, and again, I live in mound country, right? We build a lot of mounds. So a typical septic system would be a septic tank, a pump tank, a mound. And I do that same thing over and over and over again. Well, I would create a mound template. And it would have the size of my tank, the size of my pump tank, then it would have the mound system. And you could replace that with whatever you're putting in, right? It could be the trash trap to the ATU to the spray field, whatever that treatment train is. Well, if you develop that template, you can start from that every time you have a new property. And then you just put in the specific information that's relevant to that site. And it may be not that it's an ATU, it's X brand of ATU, right? And you actually have their image of that ATU already uploaded into that template. So the benefit of this is if you have a slower time of the year, right, you can actually spend a little time, create your templates, and then when you're busy installing service, all of that, you can quickly make the guides. So again, I would guess the first one of these you do honestly takes you half an hour. Because it's just kind of learning something new, getting all your images in one spot. But if you then have your templates, if you're now doing the address, a few site-specific photos, you could be doing one of these in 5 minutes. And to me, the value-added information for the customer, they're really professional looking, and ultimately it is your time. So it's not free, but the tool itself is free. So if I were going into the last install I just did, right, the option is, do I do my default content or do I start with a template? So if I wanted to start from scratch, if you've never done one of these before, you're starting with the default content. But the first thing I would do would be pick what's the most common system that you interact with, and I would call it whatever that is. It's a sand filter. It's a drip system. And I would call it that, and then I would use that as my starting spot for all of my projects moving forward. So there are several sections of the tool. So I mentioned it's a survey. So it basically walks you through these series of questions. And some of these you may choose to skip. A very obvious one would be expenses. So do you want to put information in there about what the system costs? If they're part of a homeowners association, do they pay annual fees? Do they have a service contract that has an annual fee? You can put that information in. If you say, I don't want to cover that, you can skip that section and it won't show up in their guide. But starting from the top, it's the organization of the system. So that would be the connections, the flow, the number of people served by the system. The general information, is it residential or commercial? Where is it located? What are the important setbacks on their property? So skipping expenses, then we have interior plumbing. So is there anything unique in the house, right? Do they have a composting toilet? Probably not, right? Do they have a water softener, right? Are there things inside the house that could be influencing their septic system? Then how does it leave the house, right? Usually that's a simple pipe, but we have some community systems where it can get more complicated. So here again is an example of the design flow. So the nice thing is it gives you some instructions, right? It says enter the design flow in gallons per day. Or we actually change this because I've talked about this in Canada. They don't use gallons, right? So you can put it in liters per day as well. The nice thing we added is you can see when you type in that language how it's going to show up in the guide. And this was a problem when we first did it because, for instance, if you just put 500, it would read, your system was designed for a flow of 500, which isn't as accurate, right? But now you can actually see how it lays out in the text. And then it gives them a little bit of advice as well after that. This is what's in the guide, is that they shouldn't be using 500 gallons every day, right? That's like a peak flow, which we all understand, but some homeowners think, I can use 500 gallons every single day. So then the following sections get more into the treatment train. What kind of tanks do they have? So you identify what type of tank it is, where is it accessible, and then there's an O&M table that corresponds. That's true of advanced treatment, final treatment, and the final sections don't have a lot to fill out, but it's just some more general maintenance and troubleshooting. But the troubleshooting guide we have has to work across the US. So for instance, every troubleshooting guide in Minnesota will have something about freezing. Most of you that's not relevant for, right? Fires, forest fires. I thought no one would ever use that in Minnesota. That's not true. We actually have lots of forests in northern Minnesota, and we have some areas where you could be concerned about your entire system being burned down. Think about California, right? I bet a lot of septic systems got torched. What do you do if it was yours, right? So you will want to look at that troubleshooting guide because there may be things that aren't relevant to your climate more than anything. So again, here's just showing another example where you would be uploading a location diagram of where the system is. But what I also want to point about is this thing on the left. So this is kind of all the sections I just mentioned that you need to fill out. So you can see this system has a septic tank, a pump tank, and a flow EQ tank. So it's a little bit more complicated, right? It also has an aerobic treatment unit going to a mound. So this was actually for a lodge that the University of Minnesota owns in northern Minnesota. So then again, when you select those, so this is actually when you click on tanks in the beginning, you're given this long list of tanks. You're probably only going to have 1 or 2 of them as part of your system. But when you select them, they then each show up on the left. So you can enter the size of each of those tanks, information about maintenance related to them. So again, here's another example that was done for a development of a guide. As far as how specific diagrams and photos get, that's really up to how much time and energy you have. But I would say if you're going to pick one, it would be the one on the front. Try to get to snap a photo on site. So why might you use this? I already mentioned, I think the quality of information in these guides is really high. So it's value-added information to your customers. It's professional third-party recommendations about O&M activities. So it's not you telling them. It's really, again, done by a third party. As far as your benefits, the ability to update an O&M manual as things change, I think is nice to have that flexibility. And you have the capability to create templates for commonly designed, installed, or service system. This is even something a manufacturer could do. They could, again, develop a specific O&M guide related to their technology. Again, getting it to be more specific, geared towards, and again, so we couldn't do that. We couldn't make one for every brand and type of pretreatment system out there because there's too many. But you can actually customize it to be exactly that. So again, as far as using the tool, a couple more things I just wanted to highlight. This is an example of the setback table. So this was the setback. When we asked people across the US, what setbacks do you have in your regulations? There's a lot of them, right? We actually, in our code, don't have a setback to a swimming pool because who in Minnesota has a swimming pool, right? We have lakes and it's freezing, right? Those two things don't go together. But you guys probably have a setback to a swimming pool, right? So this tried to capture them all, but you may see several on here. Again, depending on where you live in Texas, most of you live pretty far from the ocean, right? So you probably don't have an ocean setback unless you happen to live on the Gulf. So you may say, I'm never going to have an ocean setback. I'm going to delete that, right? Because I don't need that in my table. You may also say, I have one that isn't on this list. So we always added, you can add a row and put in some setback that we didn't think of. So this is an example of that troubleshooting guide I was talking about. So you can edit these, you can delete them, right? So you see some of the obvious ones at the top, right? You have sewage in your yard, you have odors, things along those lines that are pretty relevant, but then getting down the list, you may see things that don't pertain to your system or site. So this I wanted to show too at the bottom here. I showed before another spot under your projects where you could print your PDF, but at the very bottom on the left, there's something that says make a PDF. So you can also, kind of when you get to the end of it, you can select it there as well. So I mentioned replacing stock images. Here's our stock image of a septic tank. Here's an example of uploading the tank manufacturer's drawing, which again is pretty specific, but again, it actually shows the size and the dimension of the tank that's in their backyard. So here shows an example of the operation and maintenance table. And again, this one again is for the septic tank, so you can go in again and say that's not relevant to my septic tank. If you just uncheck this box, it goes away, right? It goes off the guide to delete them. So I also mentioned this example before, but just want to show it as well on how to edit. So one of the lines in the septic tank is the effluent screen. So you'll see the detail here says, again, the effluent screen. Check to make sure the effluent screen is accessible from the ground. How often should you be looking at the screen? So in here it says at the time of pumping, or annual, whichever is the shorter time period. Well, you may have an owner who you know they need to clean their screen every 6 months. That's how it is, right? So you can easily change that. The other thing that's right below this, again, is who does that? The homeowner, the service provider. And we generically chose the term service provider. That's what you'll see if it's going to be a septic professional. It may not be technically, right? It could be the installer, could be the designer, could be an operator, but that's the terminology we use. So I mentioned pre-treatment components. So these are the pre-treatment components that you have to pick from, right? ATU, single pass, recirc, wetlands, disinfection, chlorine. If you think of something that's not on this list, you can always add it, right? Add advanced treatment. But I will tell you, if you run into a system all the time that's not on our list and you wish it was, send me an email, right? We can easily add something to this list. So this is the soil dispersal components you have to pick from, right? Trenches, beds, drip, mounds, acrid, spray, aerial fill, which is something they do in North Carolina. Seepage pits, dry wells, cesspools. Those would be bad ideas, but some people still have them, right? Lagoons, ET beds, outfalls or surface discharge, LPP systems, right? We have a wide, we think, pretty wide range of systems. So a few last things before I wrap it up here. So the maintenance section has the ability to enter information about maintenance contracts. So is it under a contract? Is it a seasonal property? Special use. So the example I have here is that there's a daycare on the property, right? Which would obviously influence the system performance. So does it use electricity? If you say yes, it just puts some things in here that, right? That you need a pump, that if your electricity goes and you don't have a generator, right, you need to have a plan there. Change of use, so there are some areas of the country that if a property changes hands, has to be inspected, right? So that there's an opportunity to put in information. Are there any permitting requiring activities, right? So if they want to upgrade their home, do they need to have it inspected? Things along those lines. So kind of the next steps really are to use the tool. So it's been around for about a year now, and I think we're up to about 500 people, 2 years? Yeah, Trapper was one of the first guinea pigs. So there's around 500 people that have used the tool, a little bit more than that. But we are making small enhancements over time, so that's the reason where if you're having a problem or it's not meeting some need, or you just even simply have ideas about how to improve the tool, we have posted some examples which are kind of helpful to see a completed guide. So I'll leave this slide up for a minute if you want to get any of that down. But with that, I'm also happy now to answer any questions, any thoughts. I'm just going to see if I have it. Oh. I will go back to this slide. I again just want to thank the funding source. We have two websites again. The main one that I've been talking about here is at h2onm.com. So I'll leave that up.
Hold on, we got a couple questions.
There's a question up here, but yeah, so the question is, how does the owner get a guide? The only way for an owner to get a guide is from you. I've had people ask if we could make it so homeowners could go there and get them. The answer is we absolutely could do that, but it would take the power out of your hand. And ultimately you did all the work. So it could be, at one point we're talking to the state of Florida and they're like, we would love to integrate this with our database and create one for everyone. If we did something like that, then we could make a website where they could go get it. But the tool as it is now, the only person who can access it is the person who made it. Well, it has to be given to the homeowner. So as part of your design and your installation, you would be providing it to the system owner.
So I make a file and then
Yep.
email it to the homeowner?
Yep.
Oh.
I will say a homeowner can make their own. If they make their own guide, then it's theirs. But I don't know many owners that are going to do that.
Does it translate to Spanish at all?
Good question. Does it translate to Spanish? And the answer is not now. If we had strong requests, and what would have to come with the request would be money. the answer would be yes. But I've had, you know, you're the second person to ask me, so that means we're not quite to a critical mass. But we certainly, it wouldn't be hard.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Everyone, this is your last break for the exhibit hall. It's going to be open until 10.